Welcome to the Successful Athletes Podcast, where we interview successful athletes to make you faster. And this week we have two special guests with us instead of just one. And the reason that we have them is because they are somewhat of a dynamic duo. And we're going to be talking about mountain bike stage racing and the two races, or the different races that you have done as a pair. We're going to talk about stage racing itself, racing as a team, and then we're also going to get into some Cape Epic talk, because if you listen to our other podcast, the Ask a Cycling Coach podcast, we know that the majority of our hosts are teaming up for Cape Epic next year and also facing off against each other. So hopefully we can let them know what sort of things they're in for. And you guys totally feel free to fudge the truth. That'll make it more fun. So we have the two folks that we have with us. Down below me right here, we have Alex Mallet. How you doing, Alex?
I'm doing well, thanks. How are you?
Doing great. Where are you from, first of all? And just to give people some background, and then how'd you get started in cycling?
So my dad is from Ghana, West Africa. My mom is German. I've lived a whole bunch of different places, but I got into cycling in Seattle. I got into mountain biking in Seattle. I guess it was about 13 years ago or so. I was rehabbing from an ACL injury, and I needed to do something that was easy on the knees, and got hooked onto mountain biking.
Awesome. And then Brandon, in this case for you, Brandon Watson, I should say. Same for you. How'd you get into cycling? Where are you from?
Born and raised Los Angeles, California. Got into cycling. I don't even know. I mean, I started, I guess I got into cycling as an adult in New York when I realized I couldn't race motorcycles anymore. Alex and I used to race motorcycles when we lived in Seattle. When I moved to New York for a job, that wasn't going to work anymore. And a guy that was my trainer, he was an ex-Marine Force Recon Ironman guy. And he's like, "Hey, you like to suffer. You should try this thing called Ironman." So I was like, "Okay, what's that?" And so then I got started in racing. So I was more of a time trial bike guy. But when I went back to Seattle, Alex, I get a mountain bike. We'll say that what I showed up on was, I thought, a mountain bike. He let me know various levels of distaste that it was not, in fact, mountain bike. But I got better from there. Been racing for a while, and this is, getting outdoors and doing these endurance events is how I keep myself sane.
Awesome. You mentioned this, Alex. You mentioned the fact that your father is from Ghana, and then Brandon, you also are African American as well.
My dad is what you would call high yellow. He's light skinned. He's from Birmingham, Alabama. My mom is from New Orleans, so she's what you'd call Creole. And so I look the way I look, African American by birth.
Yeah, and that's one thing that I do want to start or cover as well. Like, this is one of the things that we're trying to, for all those that are listening to this podcast, and for all those that use TrainerRoad, everything else, we feel like it's a really good opportunity for us to make this sport more inclusive, if we can talk about these sort of things right off the bat. So firstly, in many cases, like in outdoor spaces, outdoor recreation, that sort of thing, it tends to be a place where you don't see as many African-American athletes and people participating in them. Did you come across any barriers, or do you have any suggestions for us to make the sport more inclusive as people who have come into it from that don't represent that majority that's there?
So I would say I've been fortunate to not encounter sort of people questioning why I was on a mountain bike or a bike period in the time that I've been in the sport. So that's been super gratifying. Like, that's not something I've had to deal with. I mean, I think in terms of making it more inclusive, the first step is just making it affordable, right? Giving people the ability to basically get a bike and get out there, especially like if you live in the city and not near the trails, it gets hard to, like, how do you get the bike out there even if you have a bike? That'd probably be the place I would start. Overall, certainly I found that the mountain biking community has been super accepting, and I think they were much more concerned about going out there and having fun on trails than a race thing. That's certainly been my experience. I spent a bunch of time in South Africa, which has a, shall we say, tricky racial history, and even though most of the time I was sort of the only Black person out there, it was still never an issue, right? So that kind of goes to show that, again, like I said, my experience luckily has been that it's not been an issue for me.
One of the things that comes to mind with that very aspect of making it more affordable, mountain biking in particular is a space that evolves really rapidly. And so many of us upgrade our equipment so regularly. And if we're really honest, we probably get very little for it when we try to resell it. But as unfortunate as that may seem, it's a really good opportunity for us to take those parts that we have and maybe put those together. And I bet you can probably build a bike with the spare parts you have laying around or get close to it. Maybe a bit of, just a couple odds and ends. I know that was one thing that I was able to do this year. I looked at all the parts I had, and since we were moving, I was like, oh my gosh, I need to be better. And I was able to put together a bike for a kid in our neighborhood who didn't have one. So that's a good point. Like, we can, and that's probably something within our grasp as far as individuals listening to this is chances are we have equipment that we can lend to people, that we can give to people, that we can pass on. It's just sitting there most likely.
Yeah, I mean, I would echo Alex's point about I've never really felt anything, right? I have the peculiarity of being able to kind of step into a situation and people aren't really sure what I am, and so I'm sure sometimes I experience things a little bit differently than Alex. I will say that from my back channel, the Black community has largely been holding out until we get the boost, non-boost thing sorted out in 29 versus 26. I'm just kidding. Just kidding. But it's an interesting point you raised, which is we don't. When we sell our bikes, we get what we get, but I wonder if I'm sure that there's got to be a charity that's putting bikes together for kids, but like, instead of sell your bike for cash, right? For those who can afford to sell their bike for call it a charitable write-off, like collect the bikes for the purposes of funneling those bikes to kids that would otherwise not have them. Right. That's certainly an interesting idea. Because, the N+1 theory on how many bikes I need is one that drives my wife crazy. So,
yeah, no doubt.
And the other thing, actually, I would say is I think the fact that you guys are using platforms like yours to showcase people of color and different backgrounds is super important. Because, I think it's great to have folks like Justin Williams, for example, on the podcast. But, to some extent, that's still kind of a step removed of, yeah, okay, great. He's a Black pro. Awesome. But where are the people who are, sort of not pros and who are not, absolutely world-class athletes who look like me, right? Because that's sort of the next bridge of like, sure, if you're a pro, you can make it in there, but like, what about, normal people? And so I think it's great that you guys are using your platform to sort of showcase that.
Yeah, so I'm a member of a Facebook group called the Black Triathletes Association, and it's largely, African Americans kind of encouraging each other to get out there. And, it's funny, the things that we complain about on certain forums, like you go to Slow Twitch, it's your seat is too high. If you go to the Black Triathletes, it's, I need to learn how to swim better. As the kind of
talk about perspective, huh?
Right. But it's I've never actually looked for a Black Mountain Bikes Association or anything like that on Facebook as a group, but they're starting to call us. Like, we have the tools now available to gather people from all over the country, all over the world, of like-minded individuals to kind of encourage and push, which is certainly helpful. I feel like it's getting better, but yeah, I live in Colorado, which is 4 or 5% Black. And it's, when I go out to the trails, it's, I'm the only one for sure.
Right. Yeah. Interestingly, and this is a bit of a divergence here, and simply, absolutely anecdote. This is no sort of, research or anything else, but it's been fantastic to see as a result of, this pandemic's terrible. But there are some things that are good that are coming out of it, I think. And one of them, at least locally in our area, is so many people getting on the trails that wouldn't otherwise, because the movie theaters closed, or sports aren't on TV and that sort of thing. So they've been looking up things to do and finding the trail networks. And in many cases, or I've certainly seen a percentage increase in minorities out on the trail. Whereas, like you mentioned, being in this region where we're at as well, similar to Colorado in the sense that it's very one-sided, and it's cool to see a change. And we're seeing it here. And it's something interesting with that. We've already seen an increase in donations locally to trail advocacy groups, which is awesome. And it just shows the fact that, if we can make it so that more people are aware of these things and then aid them in having access to them in one way or another, they care about them and they recognize that it's valuable. So it's a cool thing to align us all on. So,
sure.
So cool. thanks for sharing those sort of tips. And also, I want to leave this open. If you're watching this on YouTube, comments down below on what you think we could do to help with that. And when I say we, I mean all of us individually, us collectively as TrainerRoad, this podcast, whatever it may be, us as an industry, so to speak, or as a group of people that just like riding bikes. Let's come up with ideas. I really like that concept of almost like a pros closet, but for donations. That would be really cool. In fact, Pros Closet is in a good position to be able to do that. They would just have to be willing to donate some of that money because it would be right there. So anyways, Pros Closet, let's see it. That'd be cool. Okay, with that, let's get into stage racing on mountain bikes. So stage racing, first of all, is hard. And because the cumulative nature is kind of like synergistic, so to speak. It's not just stage 1 plus stage 2 equals, whatever it is at the end. But stage 2 gets a lot harder, and you also approach stage 1 differently as a result of a stage race. So in talking about mountain bike stage racing, you guys have done Swiss Epic, you've done Cape Epic, you've done races individually as well that have been multi-day events, that sort of thing. So before we get into the team aspect, just assume that I am brand new to stage racing. What are your tips that you are going to give to me to be successful at stage racing?
Go first, Alex.
Okay, let's see. Not necessarily in priority order, but still high up on the list. Number 1, if you're racing with a partner, make sure that your goals are aligned from the beginning.
Yep.
Are you going into this to finish it, or are you going to be competitive in your class? Because otherwise you quickly get into a situation where one guy is pushing and the other person is, really just is there for the experience and is not trying to get on the podium. Right. So I think that's the first thing, making sure that you're aligned with your partner. Knowing each other's strengths and weaknesses, if possible, make sure you've ridden with that person before. So you know when to leave them alone, when to help. Eat a lot. Eat more than you think you need to eat. Just keep eating and drinking. And pace yourself. You're not going to win the race on day 1. So don't go out there and, kill yourself on day 1 and think to yourself, oh, I'll just recover. I'll walk it off and be good to go the next day. Depending on the length of the race, you're going to have lots of time to make up places. So don't burn yourself out the first few days. So that's just at the beginning. Brandon, go on.
Yeah, I mean, certainly getting on the same page. It also helps to be of similar ability. I think, Alex and I, while very different riders, he's a far better technical rider than I am. So when I try to follow him downhill, it can be a bit tricky. But I tend to be a better climber than he is. There are days where that doesn't really work out. So we can play off each other's strengths and weaknesses and kind of stay close, but it can get pretty frustrating when you're trying to keep up with someone. Certainly there was a day in the Cape Epic or Swiss Epic where, for most of that race, I would say that I was better prepared for the kind of climbing we were doing. And then there was one stage where it just turned into this kind of rolly anaerobic nonsense that Alex just kind of shot off the front like a scalded cat. And I didn't see him again for a while. And for me, that was really demoralizing because I'd spent most of the time at the front, just kind of just having a good time and knowing that I was well within my abilities. And then he just, shot off the front and there was nothing I could do about it. And I was way over my heart rate threshold. And it was just like, okay, well, that, hopefully he realizes I'm not there. But we, obviously we've known each other a long time. I think we're on, when did we meet? Summer of 94. So, 26 years we've known each other as best friends. So we've kind of ridden a lot together and we kind of understand how to communicate and do all the things. And we have plenty of jokes among us to keep the atmosphere light as necessary. And so with that comes no egos. That's the other thing, right? So if he tells me I'm screwing up, I'm going to listen to him versus somebody I've never met before is like, hey, you're screwing up, you're doing this. I'd be like, why don't you settle down? You know what you're talking about. But if Alex tells me I'm screwing up, he tends to be a pretty humble guy. So that right there causes me to take note, but it's also, we've known each other a long time and I know that he's going to shoot straight. So that helps a lot.
What about pacing? So let's we'll kind of step into this. How do you plan the sort of effort that you're going to dole out over the stage race? And do you it obviously starts to add up. So how do you approach that?
Yeah, I think, again, it comes down to what your goals for the race are, right? Because I think you'll ride very differently depending on your comfort level and what you want to achieve. If you're doing your first stage race and you've never done anything like this, and most of the time your goal will probably again, unless you're a pro, but if you're a mere mortal, you'd probably be like, well, I'm in this to mostly survive it, hopefully enjoy part of it, right? And then I think your pace becomes more conservative versus I'm going for a top 10 in the masters category. And so a lot depends, I think, on how well you know the terrain and the route, because that can also help you determine pacing, right? If it's entirely new terrain, you've never ridden it before, you don't really know how hard 50K is.
Right.
Right. Like I'll take an example. I did the Alps Epic last year. Each day was between 50 and 60K. Now, there was a lot of climbing. It was 2,000 to 3,000 meters per day. But, I looked at that and went, it's 50K. How hard could it be? So I had 5 of the hardest days I've ever had on a bike in succession. Like the last day, it took us 6 hours to do 42K.
Wow.
So roughly that is like a 4.5 miles per hour.
That's a rough day.
Yeah. And that wasn't even the end. That was just to the last water point. And then we had still 3 more hours of riding.
Oh
my point is, I think pacing will depend a lot upon the terrain and how comfortable you are with it, right? And the extent to which you want to push. And then there are also days where you will have bad days and you'll have good days. There's some days where, you're climbing like it's as if you're going downhill, as if it's flat. And there are days where, a 1% grade for 200 meters can just feel like death, right? And so a lot of it is just going by feel, being smart, watching your heart rate, and knowing, what you can sustain for how long, and being mindful that you're going to have to get up and do it again the next day.
Yep. Yeah, it's because Alex, it's funny. He rides with the power meter on his mountain bike. I do not. I ride with the power meter on my road bike and my tri bike, but not on my mountain bike. Just because the efforts tend to vary, and I try to manage by heart rate. And so the pacing that I generally, because I've got a coach that I pay and a guy that I've been working with for a long time, and he will give me parameters, and we kind of settle out on, okay, I'm at the top end of what I can do. I'm feeling rough, or if I'm feeling good. Alex might say he's feeling a bit rough, so we kind of do that. But the pack racing, especially the Cape Epic, introduces different dynamics, right? Because you've got drafting all of a sudden, because there's long district roads and farm roads and whatnot where it's not flat, but definitely drafting is a possibility. And then you're talking about bridging and so how much effort do you put out. And then, I would say we didn't do a good job of, and when we tried it in 2016, was getting to the front when we knew a hill was coming, like a big hill. And so then you've kind of saved up your effort. And then all of a sudden you've got to transition to, we're walking now because somebody popped off and there's no way to kind of remount on this climb. And so now you're walking for half a mile, and that totally blows up your legs in a different way. Right. So there's a lot of things like that can really gum up all of your plans. I guess the only way I think about it is plan for a, 1,500 to 2,000 TSS week is kind of how, I think about it.
One of the things that I want to ask about that is, so let's say that Brandon, you're feeling great one day.
Mm-hmm.
What tricks have you come up with to manage yourself in a stage race when you know that if you heeded that sort of encouragement, that self-encouragement, that you would find yourself in a hole later on?
Well, so it's interesting, the day that, because I failed to finish in 2016, the Cape Epic, it's one of only 2 races, one mountain bike race I've ever failed to finish. And I blew up, I believe, Alex, keep me honest here, it was the day after you had struggles. Was it the next day or was it 2 days later? Yeah. So Alex, we were on a day where we were going up a famous part of the Cape Epic course that they tend to reuse called Baines Kloof. And it's a 7-ish mile road climb that for me, I was like, whatever, I was in happy land, and Alex was really on the struggle bus. And so I wasn't riding outside of my element. I would ride a little bit ahead because I could tell he was in a place where he didn't need to see me having a good time. So I was pulling over and kind of waiting, right? But definitely not riding over my head. And I felt great the entire day. I felt fine. Fantastic even. And then literally the very next day, I exploded in a way that neither one of us has ever seen. It was quite graphic and terrible, but I mean, I was something wrong happened, and I got massively dehydrated, and I was so far in the pain cave that it didn't matter that I had a great day the day before. And it was really, I would say the only thing I didn't do right was replacing my fluids throughout the week. And I think I just finally hit a breaking point where, things went sideways, and they went sideways in a really bad way.
How about you on that, Alex? How do you manage when you do feel excited and you feel like you're fresh? What tricks have you come up with, or what management techniques do you have to hold yourself back?
I guess I'd say that's only happened once, and I failed at that, which was the same race that Brandon's talking about. The first 2 days, I was feeling great, right? And Brandon was still getting used to the South African heat and the terrain, right? And so I was pulling us the first 2 days. And then day 3, I blew up, right? So then he was feeling good, and then he blew up the next. So I would say we've not covered ourselves in glory here.
Well, we definitely did a better job at the Swiss Epic, but yeah, the prologue of the Cape Epic was a swift punch in the mouth for me. I really thought I was prepared for what we were about to endure. And it was get behind Alex as closely as you can and shelter from the wind, because, oh my God, I was getting destroyed. It was a blast furnace and I was not ready for what I endured. And it was just a mess. And I was such a terrible disappointment at the finish line of that prologue for him. I couldn't even look him in the face. I'm like, I swear to God, I prepared. I promise you I prepared.
What did you do better at the Swiss Epic in this regard that you didn't do as well at the Cape Epic? Was it simply balancing each other out the whole time? Or, because it's interesting, there is a strange balance in what you said, right, Alex, is that you felt good on these days, so you did the work, and then Brandon felt good on those days, so he did the work, but then you found yourself at one point where both of you were just blown to pieces. So at Swiss Epic, what did you do that was better? And Brandon, feel free to chime in on this one too, of course.
I mean, I think the Swiss Epic was in some ways less demanding because it wasn't nearly as hot, and the terrain was in many ways easier. Right?
This is great having two people on. This is fantastic.
I'll let him finish, but I don't know that I agree with that point, but okay.
Granted, there were some super sketchy downhills on the Swiss Epic, which we didn't have in the Cape Epic, right? But I mean, a lot of the climbing was on either tarmac or reasonably maintained, like Jeep trail, right? Whereas the Cape Epic climbing is generally not that, right? So that was one thing. Also, the Swiss Epic was shorter. It was 5 days rather than 8.
6.
Right? Yeah, sure. There was a prologue. Okay, fine. So that helped as well, I think. And the second bit was, it was our second long stage race, right? So I think we knew much more what we were getting into.
Yes. That right there was the key. It was like, okay, we've gone through one of these. Now we understand, right? Like I was an emotional mess at the start line of the Cape Epic because it was such a gigantic unknown. And I've done a lot to that point in my racing. I'd done multiple Ironmans, more than 10 half Ironman. Like I've done a lot of racing, but it felt like this really impossible thing, right? I didn't know what to expect. I had no frame of reference, nothing. And so that was a good learning experience. It was a lot cooler at the Swiss Epic. I mean, to the point where I was wearing armbands, to start races. And it was a concern of like, are we going to get snowed on for certain of the races of the days? Although we were at altitude in the Swiss Epic, we weren't in Cape Town. And I think that hurt Alex much more than it hurt me, because it was basically like being home for me. But I would say, to Alex's point, that the roads, so the way I would compare the climbing between the two, and I love your boss. I love Nate. He's a great guy. The notion that he believes the Cape Epic is mostly flat-ish roads is,
he's changed. Okay. He's changed with that. He knows there's a lot of climbing now. He knows that. Yeah.
It's not just a lot of
that's
climbing.
The common assumption. This is a good point to bring up. The common assumption is that Cape Epic is just, a lot of big, wide open fire roads.
No. So how I'd compare the difference and where really what I got blown up on and how I prepared for the Cape Epic was I did a lot of my training on the trainer, because it's winter for me here, and Alex was living in South Africa at the time, so you could train outside. And so the kind of first experience of these tough climbs in the Cape Epic is it's 13 to 18%, but there's these gigantic rocks all over the place, and so you can't really ride in a straight line, and it's not well maintained. So there's divots and holes, and so your suspension is compressing, and you're kind of steering, and it's loose, loose on top of hard pack. And so nothing about the climb is easy. It's a struggle the whole way up, and it sucks. And so if you're not used to kind of that asymmetric power application as you're going uphill, it destroyed me, because I was used to just pedaling away on the trainer. Swiss Epic, I would say the climbs were steeper, longer, and harder in aggregate. But to Alex's point, it was tar, right? So for me, it was a steady state climb. And I was like, okay. And I would just go off the front and have a good time. because for me, that was just a much easier way to climb on my mountain bike, and in my ability to train here in town, all of the super steep stuff are, you know, mountain roads in Boulder. So they're steeper and harder if you're not used to 1 to 2. I mean, I think there were literally 2-hour climbs in the Swiss Epic where we went up, I don't know, 5,000 or 6,000 feet in one climb, which is aggressive.
Yeah, very.
Yeah.
Right.
So maybe not that much,
Yeah.
but it was a lot. I mean, it was very long. There was one climb where I remember we were still going after about an hour and a half. And I remember looking over my shoulder and seeing Alex coming around the corner. I was like, I don't know where the top is. I really don't know where the top of this thing is. We're kind of winding through this neighborhood. And I'm like, I wish I knew where the top was. It's somewhere over there. And we eventually got to the top. It was like this grass knoll. And he was like, can we just stop for a second, please?
Yeah, I mean, and that sort of highlights it, right, as well. Because I mean, the time we did the Swiss Epic, I was living in Luxembourg.
Mm-hmm.
And most of my riding was on a mountain bike, and the mountain biking stuff that I rode was short, steep, just grunty uphill stuff, right? So the longest climb was, I don't know, maybe call it 400, 500 feet, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, in theory, all other things being equal, my FTP was X. And so I should have been able to, in the Swiss Epic, just, motor up the climbs. It turns out when you're not prepared for hour-and-a-half climbs, it's a little different than, being prepared for, well, I just sort of got to grunt up this 13% incline and then it levels out a little bit and then I get to, grunt up the next thing.
Yeah.
And so that was the thing that hurt me and why the Swiss Epic was harder for me, because I simply hadn't prepared for the terrain. Maybe that's another thing to throw into this, right? Like actually looking at the course profile ahead of time and getting as much data as you can about what does this look like, right? Is it long, steady climbs? Is it a bunch of, short, painful bits? Is it something in the middle? And sort of adjusting your training accordingly, or even on the day, adopting the appropriate mindset, like knowing that right out of the gate, you're going to be climbing for 3 hours, like
Ox trail.
You got to brace yourself for that, right?
So when you're doing these stage races, and by the way, if you're seeing right now, we've changed orientations here because we had I made a Zoom mistake. So now we have Alex up next to us. If you're listening to the podcast, it really does not matter, and I apologize, but just the same. So when you're racing these stage races, let's say you're doing a one-day race, and your pace for a one-day race is X. At what percentage of X are you riding at when you're going through a stage race?
So I'll take a one-day race I did, I don't know, 2 years ago, where I went hard. It was a marathon XC race. It was about 80K, so 50 miles, about 8,000 feet of climbing.
Oh, that one.
And so that ended up taking me, I think it was 5.5, 6 hours, something like that. I think my average heart rate for that was, I want to say 150. Mm-hmm. So like that felt hard.
Relative to your max heart rate, what would that be?
Well, I mean, so my max heart rate is probably like max. I've seen it go as high as 190. Okay. But my tempo basically starts around 145, right? So you could sort of think of it as this was a 6-hour tempo ride on average, which when you factor in as mountain biking and a bunch of the stuff you're going downhill and not pedaling, it was like the uphill bits, I was going pretty hard. Right. So I was pretty done at the end of it.
Yeah.
I'd say, my average heart rate in comparison when I've done this multi-day stage race has been in the, say, 120s to 130s. So like this is middle of Z2, right? Because that's for the longer days of you're out there, I don't know, 5 to 7 to 8 hours, and you're pacing yourself. So that's sort of what just in terms of heart rate. I think in terms of power, normalized power, that's, again, middle of Z2. On the shorter days, it would sort of creep up towards the top of my Z2. Basically, it's around 70, 75%, but most of the time, 65 to 70% would sort of be my normalized power puts.
So it's interesting. I'm pulling up my Leadville file from last year just to kind of see where that shook out. But I would say that a couple of things. One, Alex he won't talk about himself, but I will. So let's be very clear about Alex's athletic bona fides. He's a world-class athlete before he ever got on a mountain bike. So he's a unique animal in that regard. Just in general, he's a kind of a freakish athlete. But He's right. In a one-day race, you definitely are pacing it harder. Now, last year I was doing the Leadman, so I paced it easier on Leadville, but my average heart rate was 137, max of 164. Now, of course, your altitude, so things change, but I was definitely well within my element. Ran the 10K the next morning and had to ruck up for the 100-mile run the next weekend. But on a one day, if certainly 50 miles or less, I have no problem pinning it to win it. If I think about the Silver Rush, last year, I can actually pull it up, but I will definitely race harder if it's a one-day race than not. So I'm pulling up my Silver Rush. The file says, no, my average was 138. Now, there was a bit of walking on that one because I had to reroute the course, and there was just a section that wasn't rideable for us mere mortals. But I would say that there is no, this notion of like percent of X pacing for the multi-day. It's more, I have heart rate targets, and that's it. Like, to get outside of those at your own peril. And I've learned that lesson very much the hard way. I am the king of blowing up at Ironman racing. I'm the king of blowing up at half Ironman racing. It is, I used to play a game, which was get off the bike, put the pin, pull the pins on the grenade, strap them to my calves, and just go after it. Right. And it never worked out well because I always overrode the course. So, with Swiss Epic, I learned that lesson. And certainly with the pacing, with Leadville, it was very much just, it was an easy day. And it's terrible to say, Leadville is an easy day, but it was very much within my limits. But as you could see from my heart rate, it just was, I took it much easier. But stage racing, once you go in the red, there's so many other things you have to do to recover from that. And then it just compounds over the course of the days that you really have to be mindful of your heart rate. Yeah. That really is the thing for me anyways.
Have you found your abilities, like your technical abilities on the bike, drop throughout the course of the week? Whether it's negotiating a tricky climb or even doing relatively simple things, you just become less, they happen with less grace, perhaps is the best way to say it.
When you're tired, that's generally true. I know on the day that I got pulled from the course by the medical staff, the last descent that we had into the aid station was, I could barely see. Like, I was full on tunnel vision, trying to follow Alex, and all I could think to myself was, well, this will be a really interesting way to die. Because I just definitely was not within my mental capacities. I was really far gone. I did 2 IV bags and slept for 17 hours after that. So, it was bad. But as with anything, as you get more tired, things get more difficult. And so you just have to manage the effort, right? You don't ever want to get into the red. And if you get into the red, you got to take it easy. I mean, there's like the Swiss Epic, the last day, we certainly climbed. It was basically go up and go down. And the go down was like riding top of the world at Whistler. And it was not easy. And the very beginning, I was well into the red and started going. I'm like, hey, buddy, we got to slow down a bit right now because I'm going to die. Like, I'm literally going to make a mistake that's going to kill me here. So we slowed it down just a little bit so I could recover, and then, kind of started picking up the pace.
Go ahead, Alex.
No, I was going to say, I think to me, it's much more correlated in some sense with I'd call it maybe your instantaneous fatigue than your accumulated fatigue.
Yes.
Right.
100%.
Yeah. So it's, yeah. Now, that said, I think there are things where, like, if you're on day 5 of a stage race and you come to a ridiculously steep uphill bit, you're much more likely to climb up and push your bike up that than you would have been on day 1, because you're like, you know what, I really don't need to blow my legs up right now because I have barely anything left, so I'm just going to take this easy.
Right. How do you manage? So one thing that I have found in stage racing is it's easy to become mentally overwhelmed, because you go in on day 1, day 2, or whatever day it may be, you're not done with the race, but you feel totally done physically. What tips do you have for people to manage that side of things? The psychological aspect of feeling overwhelmed by the fact that you have more of this suffering to go through or more of this really hard task to handle.
So I think it's, first of all, day at a time. Right? Do not look ahead to the next day or the day after that. Your job is to get through the day at hand. And then even within that day, you have to chunk it into smaller pieces, right? Like, all right, next is to get to the bottom of this climb. Next is to get up this climb. Next is to get to the next aid station, so on and so forth, right? So I've done the Cape Epic twice. The second time was in 2018. And I had 3 weeks to prepare, essentially, because a friend of mine invited me because his partner had dropped out. And I thought to myself, what do I have to lose? This will be a fun adventure. So, I did a bunch of quote unquote panic training, and showed up there. And like, I kid you not, I think the prologue was okay. Like, it was short and it hurt, but it was supposed to hurt.
Cape Town?
Yeah.
That's not an easy prologue.
Yeah, but the prologue was fine, right? Because it's an hour and 15 minutes and you're going to pin it and hurt. So fine.
Great.
It was just, day one, the first real stage. We rolled out. It was, I think when we started, it was already 85 degrees, right? I hadn't done any heat acclimation before. And so like, I distinctly remember about 45 minutes into the first stage, I thought to myself, is it too early to quit? Because sort of looking at where I was on that stage and knowing I had basically 7 more days of riding ahead was just kind of like, it almost blew my mind. And I had to remind myself, just half an hour at a time, right? Day at a time, right? And so, I made it through the race, but I distinctly remember that moment and saying to myself, do not try to think of it all at once. Just keep pedaling, stay within yourself, and you make it through day by day.
I would add to that. Alex definitely focused on the day by day aspect of it, from the being on the butt on the seat. But Jonathan, to answer your question, I would answer a bit glibly: have children, because kind of before you put your bottom on the seat, and when your bottom comes off the seat, and all the stuff that you have to do after that, it becomes a time management thing, right? And it's your ability to handle multiple tasks and prioritize and kind of mentally Gantt chart that you can figure out what you can do in parallel and what you have to serialize, what you're gonna have to wait for, so you should wait till later. Like, all of that has to process in your head. And honestly, having 3 kids and doing all of my training mostly in the morning has kind of helped me with that, because Alex and I both have, we'll call them, kind of higher end jobs in terms of time commitment. So that, for me, just being able to manage just training load plus kids plus executive level job in the tech industry was a very good preparation for all of the things that you have to do once you are off the bike, both at beginning of the day and at the end of the day, to get ready for the next day.
Yeah, let's talk about that very thing. How do you approach that? So I've seen this, even if it's just a training camp. I've seen that many times the worker bee elects themselves the worker bee, and then they're the ones that just sit to the side and they just do their own thing. And in many cases, that ends up breaking at some point. The one person doing all the off the bike work, whether it's cooking meals, preparing food, cleaning bikes, organizing, making sure everybody knows where to go and when, and covering all the different details that go on in a stage race outside of just the race itself. That can be really strenuous if it's just all passed on to one person. But also, it could work, I guess, depending on the partnership. How do you guys balance that sort of thing with everything that happens off the bike as a team? Do you try to spread that workload out? Does it change as the race goes on?
I would say with very little ego. It's, we first of all, the washing the bike and the bike maintenance, we paid. Well, the washing the bike you get as part of the Cape Epic package, but we paid for bike maintenance package. So someone was kind of taking care of our bike every day. We didn't have to worry about that, but getting the bikes to them, you can walk and push 2 bikes. So whoever was ready to just take it over would take it over. But, washing bottles or taking laundry or all that stuff, there's kind of just no egos. Whatever needed to get done, got done. But I would say that, like, for bike maintenance, I got elected the kind of field mechanic, just for whatever reason. And so I went and paid for an hour of shop time to take apart my bike and put it back together again with a guy at a shop, to just make sure I knew how to do everything, just, in case something went wrong. But other than that, I think we were fairly even split, just very little ego about it.
Yep. Yeah. And the other thing I would say is, to the extent that it's possible, try to, kind of outsource as much as you can, right? Like Brandon mentioned, that we basically ended, we like, yep, we'll pay for the mechanic package. So we just have to hand somebody the bikes and they deal with it, and we just go pick them up in the morning, right? And so taking advantage of that when you can, I think, is key, just to lessen the cognitive load.
Yep.
Right? Because, the last thing you want to do when you get off the bike after a long day is deal with logistics.
Put on my 28 sprocket because reasons, right?
Right. So that's interesting because you kind of had like a mix, right? In the sense that like you thought ahead about what responsibilities would need to be fulfilled. And in some cases you assigned those, but then you were willing to be flexible. So whether that was assigning them to other people or amongst yourselves, but then the point is you had a plan. And then you also had flexibility to work with that plan because stage racing is never, I've at least, I don't know, I'm sure it's gone perfectly for somebody, but it always seems like things go awry. There's too many unexpected and uncontrollable variables that are at play. So it's smart to have a plan, but then also have some change in place that you can work with. I want to talk about Cape Epic with the limited time that we have left here because I think it's a misunderstood race. It was very misunderstood by me. Once we started talking about it here, because I had just seen the typical, like, so the clips of race footage and such, the overhead helicopter shots, that sort of thing, which in many cases shows it when the riders are at their highest speed and they're on a wide open section where you can see multiple riders and multiple teams together. And since I've started to do more research on the route and then look at actual anecdote and examples that people have shared from riding it, it's a very different race from the smooth, like I spoke earlier, wide open fire road sort of race that just happens to happen in South Africa. It's very different from that. So what misunderstandings have you found that people have about that course? Like, what is it actually like versus what people think?
Brandon, you should go because I think you probably had the freshest eyes when you came in.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that there's a lot of things about the course that just look, being a North American resident, the topology, everything is different. The sounds are different. The animals that you're going to see are different. Like seeing baboons on the side of the trail as a North American, it's just not something you're used to seeing, right? So that it's the cognitive load of like processing what is different here. That's one thing. Two, when they talk about the course, they'll talk about, the year we did it anyways, they were bragging that it was the most single track they'd ever had. And it was like 19% single track. And there's a lot of tar, but there's a lot of what are called these district roads and farm roads. And these are really poorly maintained. They're not like fire roads that are meant to have logging trucks go up and down. These are best case, they've been cut into the mountain and somebody rode a truck up them once, maybe, right? I mean, it's just not what you think of. And so, in terms of course compare, I would say it's almost very similar to Leadville in terms of that kind of annoying dirt riding, which is you can't get into a rhythm. It's just, there's kind of potholes everywhere and you're kind of always having to adjust your line. And it's just you're never in a rhythm, save the Columbine climb, which is oddly one of the easier climbs from a getting into a rhythm point of view. Right. Mm-hmm. But like picture St. Kevin's, but with bigger rocks and potholes.
It's actually harder than single track.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's way harder, right?
Way harder.
But then sometimes as single track, like there was the one day on stage, I think it was stage 2, it was called the old ox cart path or whatever. And we walked maybe a mile and a half of this thing because somebody popped off and you just couldn't remount at all. And so you just have to adjust for the terrain. And there's going to be times where you're doing, like, I don't know at any point we ever did a descent in Cape Epic where I thought, wow, this is really sketch. I'm nervous. There were certainly some hard descents, but that wasn't what made it hard. It was just the constant kind of shock absorption of just riding over what should have been flat terrain with all of the obstacles that you're kind of dealing with on these district roads. That was hard. And then, sand is a reality down there, and they lie to you about how much sand is on the course. They lie to you often about how much sand is out there. And when you hit the sand at a high rate of speed, you hit the ground hard. So sand.
A lot of it too, like extended sections, right? It's not just you hit a sandbar and you move beyond.
Like literally a mile of sand that we were riding. It was awesome.
I think it was more than that the year we rode it.
I try to.
If it had been just a mile, that would have been fine. I think it was I feel like it was a solid hour. Maybe that was just. But in any case, But I think that the point though is that, like, yes, there's some hard sections, but. And some flat sections, but the fact is, terrain is just about never in any way comfortable. Right? Sometimes you can get in a rhythm, but most of the time you're not in a rhythm. You're having to maneuver the bike. You don't get to just spin up the hill in a straight line. And then you throw in the heat, and it sort of makes life harder. Then you throw in the fact that, depending upon, they have them in different start corrals. So I think there's probably 10 plus different start stages, start corrals, right? And if you're in one of the ones further back, the chances of you having to walk, if you hit a steep uphill bit, go up, because, that's sort of, those are the back markers, and, riding skills sort of decrease as you go sort of down the pack. And so you need to be prepared to do a reasonable amount of hike a bike, which can really blow up your legs. Right? So, yeah, I mean, the helicopter shots are great, but that's off the pros. That's not the way 95% of the field rides the race.
No. And like there's one of my favorite stories of when we did the Cape Epic, there was a descent that we were doing, and it was through, I wouldn't say it was through trees, but it was definitely an obscured kind of windy switchbacky kind of deal. And Alex was ahead of me because he was a faster downhill rider. And I come up to this corner, and there was a corner marshal there, which there's not a lot of those guys on the course. They tend to be, either at the timing mats or somewhere, but there was a course marshal right there. And he's like, we've had a rider down. And so he made me stop. And I'm like, oh, I wonder if it's Alex. And he's like, oh, it was a fella, he went around, he crashed. I'm like, okay, well, is he still on the ground? He's like, well, let me go check. And he kind of wanders off. And so that I'm just standing there. I can't ride. I can't go anywhere because there's a rider down, right? He comes back a couple minutes later. He's like, he's gone. And I made a joke about a lion taking him. He didn't find that very funny, but I had to sit there for a few minutes until they cleared me to continue because they weren't sure, what was going on with the rider. So that, it's little things like that are way out of your control. And it turns out it was Alex who hit the ground, but he got right back up and took off. But it's things like that you just don't account for. But this notion of the corrals, like I did us dirty by screwing up in the prologue and pushing us so far back that your ability to move forward in corrals is really tough when you're just bleeding time because you're walking when someone 2 corrals up isn't. Even though you're likely faster than they are, you just dump a bunch of time when you have to hop off the bike.
Looking outside of first place, who do you think is going to be last? We won't talk about the middle. Who do you think is going to suffer the most?
Oh, dear.
I feel terrible saying this. I honestly think it's going to be Nate and Sophia, and here's why. Nate has the worst luck. He just has the worst luck, right? He hasn't broken something or tried a new tire or, I put on a new chain last night and it's not. Like, it's just, he seems to have the worst luck.
And to be clear too, Brandon and Nate are friends as well. So Brandon can speak freely here. So
yeah, I mean, I don't know. He just seems to have the worst luck. That's what I worry about, right? Chad feels like he's going to come in first because he's like, I don't care. I've got my beer. I'm having a good time, right? It just, over 8 days, that attitude is going to carry him through. Yeah. I don't see that in the back, but I think it's going to be, whoever comes in last is not going to be because of time. It's going to be because of a injury or a mechanical.
So you think that Nate and Sophia are most likely to win, but also most likely to suffer some sort of...
To have a mishap, a mechanical or an injury or something like that, yeah.
Yep. Alex? You can also plead the fifth.
I am pleading the fifth.
I will be.
If I had to make a choice, I would simply flip a coin. So that's not really a choice.
I can't wait to see how it's going to go. It's going to be exciting, guys. Thanks so much for.
Well, I was going to say I'll be surprised if we're within spitting distance of any one of those 3 teams. By the way, just so we're clear.
You'll be racing it as well.
No.
Well,
okay. Alex wants.
What do you mean no?
Alex wants.
Wait. You're my partner. What do you mean no? We will not be racing it.
Alex wants to. I still have some work to do. I'm still getting through that. I did another 20-minute test today, and things are getting better. But I'm just not as. He's just a monster FTP number, and I don't have that number. So I weigh a lot less, sure, but I don't have that number. So that's going to be our limiter, which is unfortunate.
Sure, that makes sense. Well, thanks, guys, for setting aside the time to do this. This is a blast. Hopefully, this brought up some key points that people should consider on their next stage race that will make them faster. If you think about these things ahead of time, chances are it's going to make for a more enjoyable experience. So if you enjoyed this podcast episode, please subscribe and share it with others. If you want to get in touch with any of these individuals, just let us know. You can find Brandon, you're on Instagram, right? People can find you there.
Twitter. I'm easy to find, yeah.
Yeah, Brandon Watson. And Alex, is there any...
I'm not the football player from Michigan, but yeah.
And then Alex, is there anything in particular, or any way that you would prefer people get in touch with you if they have any questions?
I'm on Instagram as well under Alex_Mallet, Mallet.
Awesome.
thought he was going to say go through Brandon.
I'll have you talk to my agent.
That's a good approach.
Media personality.
That's it. All right, guys. Well, thanks so much, and we will talk to you soon. Hopefully, you end up doing Cape Epic and racing those teams. That'll be fun to watch.
Fingers crossed on COVID.
Fingers crossed.
Yeah.
Thanks, everybody.
All right. Thanks. Bye.